Hello and welcome to Phrasally Verbocious, a regular podcast wherein two Gearys talk about all things ELT. I'm Chris.
And I'm Alan.
So let's dive in.
So Alan, what are we talking about this week?
So this week we're talking about how do you know if you've taught a good lesson? So how do you know, Chris?
I think it's not an easy question to answer, is it? I think that there's a multiplicity of factors. I think because we first of all is defined by what we mean by a good lesson, right?
Yeah, because what are you trying to achieve in the first place?
Right. So I think one aspect of it, and it's not the only aspect by any means, is students with smiles on their faces.
Well, a lot of people, do you think a lot of people put the behaviour of a class down as a good or bad lesson too much, as opposed to what their outcomes were?
Well, I think that's another aspect of the conversation. I was going to say, first of all, that although I do not see my job as an entertainer, I do want my students to leave the classroom happy.
Yeah. So after all, happy paying customer.
One aspect of a good lesson is that the students are leaving happy. They're not leaving confused. They're not leaving devalued or like they've just sat through an hour of nothing. They feel that they're walking away feeling like they've had a good lesson. Now, whether or not they've learned anything, I think is something we can come on to. We can talk about behaviour in terms of an outcome's another thing, but I think actually that affective emotional dimension.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're going to talk about emotion later on in this season. I think that's for me an important aspect as they're leaving, especially the little ones, as I'm saying goodbye to them on the door, just looking at their face, looking in their eyes, checking that that we're okay.
Yeah, if you have a grumpy 6-year-old leaving your classroom, you've done something wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's an important aspect. When you're talking about behaviour, do you mean as in the sense of poor behaviour, or do you just mean human behaviour?
Well, I think it's very easy for people to gauge a lesson simply based on behaviour when that might not actually be overly accurate. I think it's sort of like a false positive when you're gauging a good lesson.
Back when I was teaching in a certain city, in a certain country, in a certain high school, I remember a head teacher saying that she could judge a lesson by looking through the classroom window. And I remember thinking, no you can't. What if I want the children to be working in groups and discussing stuff and they're sitting in silence and not succeeding? What if I want them to be out of their seats doing stuff and sitting in silence? What if I want them to be sitting in rows and they're causing chaos? So you can't judge by looking through the window.
Yeah, especially if you're doing like the snowball fight sort of activity, which
Absolutely.
everybody does.
Absolutely. So the sort of sense of the behaviour can tell us everything. It's obviously nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't like that idea of just I can look through a classroom and gauge.
Oh, well, no.
Because there's so well, all right, maybe in a state school it's slightly different, but especially in private.
No, I don't think it was a state school. I don't think it is any different at all. Because maybe I do want them talking, and she's walking past and seeing them sat in silence and thinking, okay, well done, Chris, doing a good job. And I'm thinking, well, no, I'm not. Because I said, okay, 5 minutes, discuss these points about the poem or something, and if they're kind of sat there murmuring or twiddling, then they're not doing the activity.
Yeah.
And she thinks it looks good because they're all sat, silently.
Yeah. So they're taking the sort of crowd control aspect of things as opposed to, there's no communicative approach there really.
No, and whether that be a language lesson or a literature lesson or a maths or a science lesson, you can't judge what. Unless you ask the teacher what they were hoping to do with that lesson. What sort of activities that they were going to do, and then look through the window and see if the activities are happening, well, that's a different question. But if you're just walking around the school or an academy thinking, oh, that's very noisy in there, it must be, in an academy,
chaos.
It must be, either a chaos or it must be a good lesson with lots of communication going on.
Yeah.
But it might not be. And we've all had those moments where we've looked at them, particularly adults actually, early on in the year when you just say, okay, so 5 minutes, these questions, just have a chat with your partner. And you get your notebook and you get your timer and you get ready to listen and write down good language and mistakes and things, and you can start and they go, okay, vale. And nothing happens.
Yeah, sometimes, especially adults, it takes them a while to go, oh, what, we can talk here? Because I think a lot of people are just stuck in that sort of traditional mindset of what a classroom is.
Exactly. So this idea that just by behaviour you can judge whether or not something's working is obviously nonsense. Having said that, obviously, after chaos in the classroom, that lesson's not going well, is it?
Organised chaos is, though.
Organised it is,
Yeah.
for sure. Utter chaos, less so. Okay, you brought up a key word, outcomes.
Well, yeah, I think it depends on what you're aiming towards as well. I mean, especially as a teacher, you've got this constant feedback loop in your head, because I don't think it's so much as judging every sort of aspect at the end of a lesson. I think when you're teaching, you do a lot of judging each specific activity you do. Because even though, for example, last year I had 3 or 4 B2 classes each night, the activity, like say there was a certain activity I was doing, it generally changed, it was tweaked and changed every single time.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't sit and just repeat the same thing over and over, because there's so many different variables going on. So a good lesson in one class can be completely different from a good lesson in a different class as well.
Precisely. I'm trying to repeat the same lesson, that doesn't work for that very reason.
Yeah,
something
not
I
a
said,
chance.
Something I typed in the webinar with James Taylor and, I'm going to say it wrong, Ila Coimbra, the other day,
yeah.
which was, we don't teach robots. So just because something works on Monday does not mean it's going to work on Tuesday, or with the same group on Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
It might not work with the same group again. But no, you are always judging the feedback of what's going on and making decisions. And I think that's another question that I think, especially for the newer teachers or inexperienced teachers, this idea that you just stick to your plan, and a good lesson follows a plan.
I think the more experience you get, the more skilled improvisation you get.
Ooh, improvisation. Is that quite the right word?
Well, yeah, because you can vary. We're all taught when we first do our certificates and stuff. You stick to your lesson plan, and it is law. Whereas, like the more you do this, I nearly said the older you get. I suppose you do get older, yeah. The more you just sort of bend towards what your experience says will work. I actually just bought a book on improvisation, which is actually very, very cool. And it does translate to the classroom. It's not just the theatre.
I was thinking actually theatrical improvisation is, of course, extremely well practiced, well rehearsed, planned almost, in that and that our practice and planning comes from our experience. So you think, oh, this is going south. What have I thrown in here before that's worked?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll throw that in and see if it works and see if it happens. And that can only come with experience. That can only come with things that don't work. That can only come with trying stuff. That's something you can't learn from a book. That, you just do this.
Yeah, there's. I think after you've been teaching for so long, there's so much of your teaching that simply comes from what you've tried and done in the past and seen other people do, as opposed to I've read about this.
Yeah, and I think there's also a sense that and I want to make it absolutely clear, I plan my lessons very carefully, but I think there's this sometimes utopic idea of lesson planning whereby everything is meticulously planned, all of your escape routes are planned, you've anticipated all of the errors they're going to make, you've anticipated all of the complications, you've thought about what if they finish this too quickly, and you've done, yeah, right. 24 hours teaching a week. Yeah, of course I do all of that for the lessons, and of course I don't. That would be impossible. But what I have got at this point, obviously, is a wealth of strategies, activities, and a sense. They're finding this much easier / much more difficult than I'd anticipated, especially in September, October, when you're getting to know your groups.
Yeah.
What have I got up my sleeve that will be another practice of this activity, of this language pointer, this vocabulary, or something that I can do that I can disguise as a game, or a speaking activity. But these are all things that it's all very well saying I can sit down and I can plan them, but actually a lot of it comes out of reacting to what's happening in the classroom.
I think as well with the reacting point, I think as well you got to take into consideration that students themselves, when you have 10 people in a room or 15 or whatever it is, they might just throw up something and you go, hang on, we're going to focus on what you've just said because that's genius. I remember 2 points this year where must have been just before Christmas. I had quite a young kids group. They were all about 8, 9 each, and they were asking me this really cool point because the cogs were obviously the cogs were ticking between Spanish and English, and they went, well, it's really easy in Spanish to spot where a question is because you have the different symbols. We were doing something completely different, and I just so happened to be writing questions on the board in English. And then they went, it's really easy to spot a question in Spanish. What gives with the whole English? How do you know it's a question? So then I was like, do you know what? We are going to focus on question forms here because that's actually a genius question for you to, because they're obviously showing interest in the two differences of languages. So you have an absolute entire area to go down there, just even at their age. I think another one this year as well was we were talking about I can't remember what the subject matter was with a B2 class, and one of the students basically just threw out because he just sort of has like a satirical sort of take on life. He was probably Irish in a past life. He came out with a sentence, sure, why are we thinking about all these things in the future? Because you're just going to die anyway. Which, because it was a teenage class, everybody else got into this big philosophical discussion, and it became like a full-on, very well-worded discussion in their second language. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to just let this run, and I've got my little notebook here, I'm in listening mode, let's see what's said. And I ended up filling it must have been at least 2 sides of an A4 page with just fantastic stuff I heard. And there was very little correction as well. Now, fair enough, it was B2. But it was just this amazing sort of 15-minute class discussion. All 10 got really into it because they all had a strong opinion on it.
Right, so exactly. So you've been your plan.
Yeah.
You've still taught a good lesson because the students have been doing production and communication, as you say, in their second language.
It was the kind of lessons, those kind of lessons where just something just awesome happens and you come out buzzing from it. It was one of those. It was just there was just so much amazing, and they were coming off with vocabulary and grammar. It's just all right, it B2, but this was impressive. This, I was really, really impressed with all of them.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's those. And that's not something you can plan for. I had talking about the future. I have a 1-to-1 class with a 9-10-year-old. Actually, last week I went in, had my plan with all sorts of the vocabulary of the seasons, a little reading exercise, blah blah blah. I don't know what to do at the weekend, and she told me. And then in telling me, was trying to tell me about what she was going to do next weekend, and couldn't because she didn't have the structures. Mm-hmm. So I told her the future. And the distinction between will and going to for planned events and decisions in the moment. Okay, well I can do that. Kind of attitude. I thought, well, that's a good lesson then, isn't it? Or at least that part of it is. That's a good moment because you're also responding to student needs.
Yeah.
I think the question of what good lessons are, what good teaching is it's one of those things that the lines between subjectivity and objectivity are somewhat blurred, if that's not a controversial thing to say.
I think the subjectivity one's quite important because what one person deems as quite good might be quite different. If someone's quite traditional in their teaching compared to if someone is quite happier to sort of play by ear and play it by wire,
But I think the problem here is that if you're going to judge, the problem with judging teaching, and this is something that in my new role I'm having to think about quite a lot. I've had to think about it quite a lot during previous management roles, but I'm thinking about it as my day-to-day thing at the moment, is you can't judge methods on the sense of their methods, because just because I couldn't make something work in the classroom doesn't mean somebody else can't, and vice versa. Just because I would do it this way doesn't mean that somebody else should. If you judge on outcome, how do you know that it was the teaching that got the students to the outcome?
Yeah. Because the student still has to do it themselves, yeah.
And maybe they've done it all by themselves without any teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I hope not. I hope I'm doing something useful. But I don't think it's that simple, and I think that's where things like self, peer, and manager observation and reflection and reflective conversation and reflective feedback, not, that was a great lesson, good job, but, there's some good things in there, here they were, or here's what I think, do you agree? What worked in that lesson for you? How to observe is a whole other library of books. But I think it's those, also that kind of 360, that three-pronged approach of self, also peer, and as well as manager kind of observation and reflection is useful. We've done self-observation, haven't we, Alan?
Yeah, we did this cool thing when we worked. I thought it was cool when we worked together in Catherine's, where our boss had a GoPro.
It was cool.
For sticking in, it was one of them, what are the fish bulb lenses, and it was stuck at the back of your classroom, and if you were trying something new, or it was a general thing for first time teachers as well, where you got to watch yourself teach a class of your choice. I think in the end I used it probably about a dozen times a year, well maybe a dozen times, just because I was trying and testing new things on different students and stuff. But I think it's really interesting when you just watch yourself teach, because it's horrible, but there's so many. Well, it's a bit like editing a podcast as well. There's so many things you don't notice you do until you watch yourself do it. But it's a really cool way of gauging your teaching.
It's quite a light-opening experience.
Or you fidgeting with pens, or you tripping over a table, or yeah.
I'm quite clumsy when I'm teaching.
Yeah, sure, I broke that table once when I fell. I was walking backwards towards the board to write something on. I broke it. fell over backwards and broke the table. Had to get a new one.
You see, I'm not clumsy in real life. I am in the classroom. No, but then it's really, as you say, you see things you don't know you're doing, and these can be good or bad. But you also are able to, evaluate how things are working. And the great thing as well of having a camera in the corner of the room, and of course, depending on where you're teaching, you have to make sure you've got the correct, the correct permissions and authorizations to do this. But the things that you can see when your back's turned.
Yeah.
Because even though they know the camera's there, it doesn't take them long to forget the camera's there and just go back to being their normal selves.
Mm-hmm.
And you think you explained the point really nicely, and you turn and you just do something, or you work with a student, and then behind your back they're all sort of shrugging and going, "What the hell are we doing?" Or the opposite, of course.
I thought it was really good for watching my own clarity of explanations.
Yes.
I thought it was really helpful, because some points, like even if you're explaining, say, a large thing, you start to notice, okay, there's maybe that one little fine point about 3/4 of the way, could have been slowed down or sped up. It's like little things as well. It's not just an overall watching 90 minutes. There's little tiny minute things help.
If you use it as a reflective tool, so if you think, okay, I'm going to put that in my classroom, and I have it on for 20 minutes, and I'm going to look at giving instructions, so I know which section I want to record of my lesson. And therefore, when you're planning, that's what's in your mind as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it a very useful experience without even looking at the video afterwards. I did, but thinking, yeah, I'm actually thinking about my instructions. I'm thinking about every word.
Yeah.
There's no extraneous language here that's going to confuse them. And indeed it didn't, which was nice. And then you also try and apply that to your everyday.
I don't know about you, but I actually found it, I think I only did like full complete lessons maybe twice, maybe even 3 times. I actually found it more useful to focus on a specific point.
Right.
Were you the same? Because there were certain things I only focused on, like here's a 15-minute section or here's a 20-minute section, and that was the specific things.
I don't need to watch 80 minutes to a lesson to determine how, or not to determine, but to reflect on my instructions giving. Or I don't need to watch 80 minutes to think about how I assess. I just need to have it on for a certain part of the lesson to see what's going on. So I think that sort of self-reflection and that self-observation is really useful. I also think that peer observation is really useful.
I think it's really good fun. Because you see a teacher you work with who you've probably not actually seen teach before until you're in the room. There was a thing.
Absolutely. And just being able to share ideas with somebody who's on a level with you.
Yeah. There was a thing we had that I thought worked really well when I worked in Belfast was at the end of sessions when everybody had finished their last class, all the students left, but we had set aside another hour at night we finished early. It wasn't Spanish times like we finished at 7:30, so we stayed to 8:30. But during that 1 hour session on a Thursday night, you would sit down with a cup of coffee, and everybody would sort of it would be a group team effort with all the teachers going, this worked, this didn't, how does this improve? Has anybody got ideas for pre-ESOL? Has anybody got ideas for C1? It was really, really good for certain points and just sort of team effort at the end of the day. I thought it worked really, really well.
Well, sharing is always good.
Yeah.
Sharing is always good. Here's a question for you. Student opinions of you. If your students like you, does that make you a good teacher?
Not necessarily, but I think it makes life much easier.
Right, I agree.
It's definitely not. It's not black and white. You can have amazing people in the room, but when it comes down to getting past an exam or something, they might not be suitable for you. I think this is why I agree with the students need a new teacher every year aspect, because I think they need to see a different variety of personality in the room. If they like you, it makes classes really easy, and it makes there's no behavioural issues. Then it means there's no issues with somebody not doing their homework and stuff. I don't think it means you're a good or bad teacher, though.
No.
I mean, you're gonna have personality clashes anyway.
I think one of the interesting things that I noticed about this when I was obviously looking at the episode plan and this question being here is that I was thinking about somebody I worked with again in a universe far, far away, in the dating system, who the students actively loathed. And I'll say that again so I can be clear with the pronunciation. Loathed. Hated. But anybody who wanted to pass their GCSE wanted to be in that teacher's class.
Really? Okay.
That teacher got results. They knew they'd pass. They didn't like the man, and they didn't like the methods. This teacher was actively hated. But the students, she made it work.
See, I think there's a difference between a teacher who can be actively hated but makes it work, or a teacher who's actively disliked and loses a class. And I think it works the other way as well, where a teacher, they can be liked but get nowhere, but they can also be liked and get everywhere.
Many of them.
Yeah.
There's many teachers that are liked to get nowhere, and because they're liked and because the atmosphere is nice and because the children, leave the classroom smiling or whatever, everyone thinks everything's fine.
But maybe that's the problem.
There's actually nothing going on.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I wouldn't want to be in that situation of being an actively hated teacher. And I think it was it's extraordinary that this teacher could get results with students that didn't particularly like her. But that was the reality. So I think whilst it's useful, whilst it's helpful that the students like you and you get with them and you have a good relationship, I don't think it's not the end of the story.
It's not the end of the story, but it can play a major, major part.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are coming from I know I'm certainly coming from a strict high school, grammar school background. Right. I think there has to be a bit of leeway in sort of, the way some people like to do the classroom rules and the a learner's contract at the start of every year.
Yeah, I don't.
I actually stopped doing that because it sort of depends on how you go. I do with the young ones, I do have behavioural stuff, but that's a whole affective thing we'll do in another episode. I had this interesting thing 2 years ago, which was actually your ex-students who became my students. Class of all teenage boys. And before class, their class was at 4:10, so they got out of school. They went to the sweet shop across the road, and they came in class. Now,
Loaded up on sugar.
yeah, but the standard thing would be a teacher would say, okay, if all 10 of them are going to the sweet shop and then coming in, you as a kid, the first thing you want to do is eat your sweets.
Right.
The first thing the teacher wants to do is don't eat in my classroom. So I actually, about 3 weeks into the year or something, I actually spotted this thing where it's like, well, hang on. Why don't we make the rule is if you're following the class well, if you're taking part and if you're, doing the thing right, eat away. Not a problem. But if you don't take part and all that, then you're not allowed to eat your sweets. You have to put them in your bag. Those kids loved that idea. It was unbelievable, like, how effective that was. Because everybody was putting their hand up. The what, sorry?
It's just motivation.
Yeah, everybody was putting their hand up, even the shy kids, because it's like, yeah, thank you. Okay, you can have a sweet.
Skinner behaviourism.
So interestingly enough, this week, when we're talking about students like you, good and bad teachers, it came up this week, somebody had asked me about my language teachers in high school, and how I got on with them, and if it did and if it didn't and all that. So basically in my high school, for 5 years, you studied French and German. The first 3 years, you studied both. And then for 4th and 5th year, so for your 2 GCSE years, you either kept them both or you dropped one. But it was mandatory you did one for your GCSE. Now, in talking about good and bad teachers, the French teacher I had from high school years 1 to 3, great teacher, thought he was really cool, really funny, really fun. Everybody left with a smile on the face. But then you got a bit older and you're like, I didn't learn anything in that class. Because I changed, it was just the way the timetable worked. It was completely random that I changed to the head of languages for my GCSE 2 years. And quite frankly, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have got a GCSE in French. Because he was a genuinely good teacher. It sounds harsh when you say this, but it's probably not the best wording. There was less sort of personality in the class, and it was more exam focused, which makes sense. But everybody worked for him. He was one of those teachers where if they tell you to do something, you go, yeah, grand, I'll go and do it. And he was a really good teacher. Whereas German for me was a weird thing. Now, I gave it up after 3 years. But just to explain my first year in German. Now, I came from to use the Irish word, a culty primary school. So from the countryside. English was the only language that was in the primary school. There was no idea of other languages. Didn't come up, didn't compute. Now this was like the early 90s, so like nobody went abroad either. But I remember it must have been maybe the first month of German. Now, didn't have a clue about German. 11-year-old in a big high school that I didn't know anybody. Now this teacher sort of did something that I would never do to a student, and it still annoys me. Handing out homeworks back, and for whatever this exercise was, I had scored the lowest out of 35 kids or something. But she dragged me up to the front of the classroom. Now bear in mind this was like little 11-year-old me, not having a notion what was going on. And sort of ridiculed my homework in front of everybody by writing it on the blackboard. Now, for the next 3 years, I basically went on strike in her class. Never give her a homework, never done a bead in class, dropped the language as soon as I could, never thought anything about it again. Because she was just such a spiteful human being. I didn't do a bead for her ever since. And that was like first month in the first year of high school. So I kind of try to not do what she did. Because, I mean, nothing puts a student off learning a language or learning anything by being ridiculed in front of a bunch of strangers.
Well, of course,
feeling
that's
them
one of those
really
things.
isolated.
I often say that I learned the most about teaching from my bad teachers than I did from my good teachers.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. You learn. Yeah, here's what not to do. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to finish up, I have a question for you, Alan.
All right.
How often do you worry that you're not a very good teacher?
Every single class. I think isn't that why we do CPD? There's just that constant fear of what if I'm slipping, or that constant fear of have I still got that? Or that constant fear of I don't know.
I'm not sure that I worry about it every single class. I would say that every single class I wonder/worry about the class.
Yeah, you judge yourself in every single class.
Right, and then I will have maybe the existential angst.
Yeah.
every few weeks, maybe, I don't know. I think that's a great question to end on, actually, and maybe invite our listeners to tweet us with their thoughts about what makes a good lesson, and obviously maybe as well how often they worry about not being a good teacher, and then if they want to. I mean,
I'd be more worried if people didn't worry that
Right.
they were a good teacher.
Yeah.
I think that's the whole thing with teaching, isn't it? Because, like, with cultural changes, with time changing, with different methods coming in and out of fashion, with sort of different needs with students, you gotta be on your feet. You gotta be on your toes the whole time.
Absolutely.
Like,
Absolutely.
if you get too relaxed in this career, I don't want to be in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. If you'd like to get in touch, you can tweet us
At Phrasally on Twitter.
You can email us.
PhrasallyVerbocious@gmail.com.
You can check out our show notes online at
PhrasallyVerbociouspodcast.blogspot.com.
And please like, review and comment us on your podcast subscription service of choice. Goodbye.
Goodbye.